So let's dig into this with Gabriel Debenedetti. He is a national political reporter with Politico, and he is joining us from Politico's headquarters in Arlington, Virginia. Good to see you, Gabe.
Thanks for having me.
So we've got these conflicting signals on foreign policy from three officials that normally and traditionally are expected to speak with one voice. We know, obviously, in every presidential administration, there are different points of view, but what are the implications of this specific discrepancy?
Well, there are a lot of implications. One of them is that we don't, as a public, don't know exactly what the next steps are going to look like with respect to the administration's posture towards Syria, whether it's, sending troops, requesting a declaration of war or something like that with the Congress, or simply sort of staying the course and working back channels. As you say, this is not necessarily the most surprising thing on earth. There have been other confusions about where exactly the Trump administration stands on other issues, but there are pretty clear implications of this one, and I think what you're going to start to see from especially Democrats, but also Republicans on Capitol Hill, is a little bit more pressure on the White House to really articulate what the next steps are going to be and what the policy will be moving forward.
Now, some critics have slammed the president for those airstrikes because they say he's abandoned his ideological position of non-interventionism. But I guess the question for a lot of people is, why can't a president be flexible, to borrow a word that Mr. Trump used last week?
That's exactly what he's been saying, which is, listen, I know a different set of things now than I knew before, so I've changed my mind. But of course, he is someone who has criticized President Obama for doing a number of the things that he is now doing. There is obviously no one arguing that the president should not be flexible, but there is a decent amount of pressure on the president, on the White House more generally, and on the administration to be able to follow its promises. Obviously, President Trump is someone who talks about the campaign still a lot, and he often talked about keeping the promises from the campaign. But if he now is saying, well, forget those promises, I know a new set of facts, we're going to start going in a different direction here, there's a real question about his level of support, not only among regular voters, but among other Republican lawmakers as well.
So let me ask you about Secretary of State Rex Tillerson's visit to Moscow this week, though he's not meeting with the Russian President Vladimir Putin. Also, sort of bizarre, once again, the press will not be accompanying the Secretary of State on this trip. So what should we be watching for, and how will we find out what's going on?
Well, I think what we're going to see, much like we did last time he went on a trip without the press, which constitutes all of his trips so far, is what we're going to get is a readout from foreign press, which obviously is going to be spun by foreign governments. The United States government will, of course, put out its own version of events. But what's really important to look at here is that this is going to be the highest stakes trip that he's had so far. Obviously, he's had to deal with the North Korea question on his previous trip, but this is one that really wraps in everything going on around the globe, at least in terms of the top priority foreign policy issues. He's going to have to engage with the Russian government over the question of Syria, but also the broader questions about our relationship with Russia, with, of course, the questions of China and North Korea looming. So it's an extremely high-pressure trip for Tillerson, who's not done a lot of these so far, and we're basically going to have to wait and see what happens because, as you note, there won't be second-to-second updates from diplomatic press corps on the ground with him.
Are you hearing, Gabe, that that's going to change at all? It's interesting that with two of the most important countries that we have to deal with, that the president has to deal with, China and Russia, we are going to be getting the information about what's going on in those meetings and what the trip means from the foreign press.
Yeah, there's obviously a lot of pressure on the State Department and on the administration more broadly to change this policy. But what they say is they're not barring reporters from showing up at these events, which is obviously true. The difference is that we don't have a group of reporters who is accustomed to traveling with Tillerson doing so. Now, this is Tillerson specific. There are other members of the cabinet who have been open to traveling with press in a way that Secretary Tillerson has not. But as more and more of these trips happen, and as more and more often we see examples of the overall narrative being spun by foreign governments, there's reason to believe that there will be slightly more pressure on the State Department to bring along reporters who aren't necessarily sympathetic, but who will at least be willing to listen to the United States government's version of what goes on. And what you will see is a lot of news outlets will certainly send reporters to the scene of the meetings. They just won't travel with the secretary himself.
Yeah, I wonder if a lot of that has to do with the fact that he's a former CEO, having worked in business for 20 years before I became a journalist. I know that CEOs don't like to be around reporters, and that may be a leftover byproduct of his time as the CEO of ExxonMobil. So let me ask you about this, Gabe. The palace intrigue within the White House. Last week, White House Chief Strategist Steve Bannon was removed from the National Security Council, and yesterday we learned that Deputy National Security Advisor Katie McFarland is moving to another role. We know there have been reports in the New York Times and others, Politico, of some infighting between Jared Kushner, who has a very, very large portfolio, and Mr. Bannon. What is the significance of these shakeups?
Well, I think what you saw with McFarland, who it seems is going to be leaving the National Security Council for what many people have reported is potentially a diplomatic post as the ambassador in Singapore, is she was left over from the Michael Flynn era in the National Security Council. She was brought in with Flynn, who of course has exited the building since then, and this was a way for them to move her out of there. But what we've also seen in the last week, as you noted, is Steve Bannon, the chief strategist for President Trump, taken off the National Security Council. This is the White House trying to work out exactly who fits where in its really intricate puzzle piece as they try to get so many policies up the ground and running, because of course President Trump entered office promising the world to his supporters, but there is no doubt that there is tension between the factions represented by Jared Kushner, who's a senior advisor but also the president's son-in-law, and Bannon. It's unclear exactly who's up, who's down in the minute-to-minute of this, but it does seem to be clear that Bannon's direct influence over the president, at least on foreign policy matters, at least seems to be waning. He was reported to not be a big fan of the Syria strikes.
All right, Gabe Debenedetti from Politico. As always, my friend, thank you very much.
Thank you.